you too. Yeah, I came in last minute. Sorry. Okay, Dr. Randy Guliuzza. He is here today. He is the president of the Institute for Creation Research. He is leading biology design theorist. He has actively expanded ICR's scientific research and the critical endeavor to develop a theory of biological design. He holds the Doctor of Medicine from the University of Minnesota and a Master of Public Health from Harvard University. He served as Chief of Aerospace Medicine for the 28th Bomb Wing. Prior, he worked 9 years in the Navy Civil Engineer Corps and is a registered professional engineer. Dr. Guliuzza also has a degree in theology from Moody Bible Institute. He is the author of multiple books and technical papers. Let's give Dr. Randy Guliuzza a warm DSA welcome.
Well, good morning, good morning. I have looked forward to this event for months and months. Anytime I can speak to a group who are fully interested in the topic of creation science and have been following it, and it looks like some of you for decades and decades on that, it is always a good time. There's a lot of people who come to our events and they're just interested in it, or maybe they have a passing interest or no interest at all. But when I come to places like Design Science Association, Twin Cities Creation Science Association, things like that, you know you have an audience who they're not creation rookies. They're really creation savvy in so many ways. And so you can talk about things that you normally wouldn't be able to talk about because you don't have to lay a lot of background. You have the background. You have that knowledge. You have a lot of experience. And even today, it's going to be new. So if you're here today and you are open to new research, if you like to see new research, today is for you. And if you are here today and you are open to new ideas, new thinking from things that we've even done as creationists before, today is for you. And I hope, and I've been praying, that today, for some of you, today will change your life. You will not, from this day forward, see, and I'm not going to say God or even Christ exactly the same, but you will not see creatures, how you understand them, the same from this day going forward. You'll see them in a completely new light. So that is the goal of today's talk. Mark told me that we take a break during the middle of my talk so that everybody can get some snacks and things like that, pick up the magazine, the Acts and Facts magazine, and then we'll resume. So I'll find a place where we'll kind of wrap it up, then we'll take our break, and then we'll resume again today. So what are we going to do? First of all, we're going to cover something which many people have never covered, not even evolutionists or not many creationists. We're going to cover theory. And initially, we're going to look at evolutionary theory and kind of understand that. So we're going to look at what theory is, and then we're going to look at the background for evolutionary theory. You may not understand it. Most evolutionists don't understand it. But when we understand their theory and why they built certain elements into their theory, and why they put those in, then it'll be much easier to show how we need to counter those in building a theory of biological design. And the main feature, the main function of this theory of biological design is exactly what the screen says up there at the top, that this will be an organism focused. So if there's nothing that changes in this day, and only that will be a score. If from this time on you start looking at organisms, them in terms of what they can do and explaining their functions and what they can do, that will be a big win. Now this material has been presented. It's been presented several times, and just a few years ago at the International Conference on Creationism, we presented all this material, particularly the work on the cavefish. So there it is up on the screen for those of you who really like the technical materials. That is the paper that we presented. You can download it. You can download it for free. And I have the link up there, if those of you, those who take pictures of the screen, if you want to download that talk. Now, everything we're going to talk about today is vitally important. And we are not the only ones who are having a revolution in thinking in terms of a theory of biological design. There's a revolution going on in evolutionary thinking. And it's because the findings that are coming in from all of the research are not aligning. They're not aligning at all with current evolutionary thinking. In fact, many of them are absolutely contrary to it. The findings have been coming in for several decades. In the early 2000s, I did a debate with a man named Massimo Pigliucci, and some of you have heard of him. He's an ardent evolutionist. And at the time, I was only interested in having arguments against evolution. And the evolutionists that I was debating told me, well, the arguments against evolution are good, but if you really are serious, you need to develop a serious theory, because theory is what constrains everything. And he said that evolutionary theory was undergoing a revolution, and this was about 2001, 2002, that he was telling me this. By 2016, there was a major conference in England in order to reconsider evolutionary theory. Many of you have heard of it, maybe the extended evolutionary theory or the third way of evolutionary theory. Nature even had an article about it in their journal, and this is what it was called: Does evolutionary theory need a rethink? And that was putting it mildly. They could have said, does evolutionary theory need an overhaul? Because one quote from the text, and it's full of many important things mentioned, that this is no academic storm in an academic tea room. It's a struggle for the very soul of the discipline. When you have features that are coming in that don't align with anything that you were taught in evolutionary theory, that is a major upheaval. And it says it's an upheaval over the fundamental causes of evolutionary change. And if you are interested in theory, this book right here, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory by Stephen Jay Gould, published in 2002, just right before he passed away. It's a big, thick book. One of my colleagues read it, and he said, you don't want to read that book. It doesn't say anything favoring evolution. So for several years, I never read the book, but then I picked it up and I realized, of course it's not saying anything for evolution. Gould is explaining the history of evolutionary thinking, and he's explaining how and why evolutionary theory was put together. Evolutionary theory has a purpose, and he's explaining why certain things were put into the theory in order to achieve the purpose of where they were going and how they were going to structure thinking. So it was never meant to be an argument for it. It was to tell you how evolutionary theory affects people's thinking. And theory, as he made very clear in this book, is really a working hypothesis. And so a lot of people at times, he will put up the picture of Darwin with his tree of life, and he says, I think. And they kind of mock it like, well, he doesn't really know, but he's really putting forth his hypothesis. I think, or he could have said, I hypothesize that this is how life has diverged over time. And that's what a theory is. It's a hypothesis. I think that this may be how things are working, or I hypothesize that. And it is a working hypothesis. It's a framework that takes different ideas that you see or different observations and tries to pull this one close to this one and this one close to this one and make sense out of all of the diverse things that we're seeing in a particular field. It could be astronomy, geology, in this particular case, it's biology. And then once you take all of these observations and you put them together, you have a hypothesis that you can then test. And it's supposed to do some work for you, a theory is. First of all, it's supposed to answer big questions, really big questions. And that's what the major theory is. And so in this particular case with evolutionary theory, as we'll see in a second, the big question that evolutionary theory was supposed to answer is, why do organisms look so incredibly designed? So if you're taking notes, this is a change, because many of you are thinking it's supposed to explain, life from a common ancestor, or maybe it's supposed to explain the diversity of life on Earth. It does tangentially, but the big question that Darwin was after is, why do creatures look so incredibly designed? Was there a designer, or is there a natural process which can accomplish the same thing? And then, once you have your narrative, once you have your framework, it shapes your interpretations of what you see. So in geology, with a uniformitarian framework, when they see layers out there in the rocks, they are seeing vast inland oceans. They are seeing incredible amounts of time. They are seeing in the fossil record a history of the evolution of life on Earth. We come from a completely different perspective. We come from a perspective of flood geology. So when we see those layers, we see evidences of a worldwide flood. We see layers stacked flat on top of each other with little time between them. We see the fossil record as a record of really judgment, where these creatures are being trapped by the billions very, very rapidly. And it's evidence of a rapid covering by water. And so we see things differently, and that is how theory constrains how you interpret the data. And then, of course, if it's a research program, it's going to govern the questions that you are going to ask. Why does it do this? And it even eliminates some questions that you're not allowed to ask. So in evolutionary theory, one question that you're not even allowed to ask is, does this function for a purpose? Purpose is out. So purpose-related questions aren't really even on the table in evolutionary theory. And evolutionists who ask that question, or even evolutionists who use the word "this does for purpose," are slapped down by other evolutionists because purpose isn't even an allowable question. Could this have been made by an intelligent designer? Off the table. Questions are off. So theory even lets questions in the door and keeps other questions out of the door. It helps you make predictions of findings, and it guides your research agenda. And we have had that as creationists in the realm of geology for a long time, but we do not have something like that as it relates to biology. What is our research agenda in relation to biology? Is it just to say, oh, that looks complicated, it must have been engineered? Or do we have something that we say, this is where we're going to go with research. Here's a question we're going to test. How are we going to test that question? What do we expect to find? What are our basic assumptions? This is why we need to put together a theory. And so theory is the framework which helps you answer the big questions and interpret your observations. And what it really does for most people, even from a young age, is it puts in your minds little cubby holes. Little cubby holes and these cubby holes have labels. And initially, there's nothing in the cubby holes. They tell you the story. This is how life evolved, and this is how it happened. So you put the cubby holes, and then as people go through life and they observe something, they say, oh, it goes here. I interpret it here. It goes in this cubby hole. And they see something else. Oh, I interpret it here. And it goes in this cubby hole. And as time goes on, and as you fill these in, the theory tends to make sense in your mind. And the theory is constraining your thinking, and the theory is always leading you to a particular conclusion of how you're going to think about something. And that's what evolutionary theory does. And really, it's a long story. It's a long story of which we're filling in the key parts. We tell you the story in advance. You believe the story up front, even if there's no evidence up front, and then as you go through life and you observe things, you fill it in, and it becomes evidence for your story. And that's what evolutionary theory does, and that's why so many people say, well, that's kind of circular thinking. I see so much circular thinking in evolutionary theory. That's because that's what theory does. I expect it to do this, then when I see it, I interpret it in terms of what I expect it to do, and then boom, it goes in that cubby hole. And it becomes evidence for what I expect to find. And so we can go through our entire talk and look at a cave study. And that cave study is going to be our cave fish. Our case study will be our cave fish. So here's the question. How does that happen? You see the fish up on the screen. I show you two different pictures of them. You see a surface fish with eyes and pigmentation. And then right below it in both pictures, you see a cave fish. Hypopigmented, no eyes. They're related. They can mate with each other. They can have offspring. How in the world do you go from a fish that looks like the surface fish to the cave fish? How does that happen? If you were to read evolutionary literature, they would tell you a narrative. And initially the narrative went back 8 million years. 8 million. 8 million years ago, these populations were divided in some way. And then over 8 million years, due to a whole series of innumerable random genetic mutations, copying errors, mistakes, of which most of them were poor, but occasionally one of them might lead to a reduction in the eyes. And since it's no disadvantage in the cave, over a long, long period of time, the eyes eventually disappeared. The same thing happened with their pigmentation. These genes were broken. They were dysregulated. Some of them might have even been eliminated. And of course, the 8 million years then dropped to 2 million years, and then it dropped to 1 million years, and now it's down to almost in real time on these things. So we have to contemplate two important characteristics of organisms as we go through our case study. What is true of organisms? Well, this book that just came out in 2024, How Life Works by Philip Ball, he dares to address two things which are characteristic of all creatures, which have never been rolled into evolutionary theory but must be considered. As it says here, Ball grapples with the philosophical question of what makes any organism alive. That's a big question. That's one of the big questions that need to be answered. Why are you alive and the chair you're sitting on isn't? Agency, he's going to argue, the ability of an organism to bring about change to itself or to its environment to achieve a goal, is one of those key characteristics of being alive. Back down to the red, Ball is not alone in calling for a drastic rethink of how the scientists discuss biology, and all argue that agency and purpose are definitive characteristics of life that have been overlooked in conventional gene-centric views of biology. So you see a crack. You see a crack in evolutionary theory. You see something that isn't consistent. But you see a crack with something that does fit with the theory of biological design. Because agency, the ability of organisms to want to do things, and that the fact that they function on purpose, certainly fits with the design. So we can go do a head-to-head test of major assumptions and a major purpose of experimentation. So as we go through today's talk, we're going to hopefully understand engineered creatures. Now that we have this background of what theory is going to do for us in 4 easy steps. And the first step is this. Understand. This is a lot of the background. Understand why current evolutionary theory was constructed over time as an anti-design narrative. And that's what its purpose is. Because Darwin's big question is, how do these creatures get here, and why do they look so incredibly designed? And he's going to come up with an anti-design narrative. He's going to come up with a narrative which in and of itself, the very narrative itself, is going to be fundamentally anti-design. And when we understand that, we'll be able to build our theory of biological design. So, how do we account for this incredible design of creatures? Is it a natural process, or is it due to an intelligent agent, which many of us would clearly say is God? Well, here's a paper. It's probably one of the most important papers that the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences has published as it relates to theory. It was written by the man in the picture, Francis Ayala, He was the president of the American Academy of Sciences at that time. He's now passed away. But he was a perceptive thinker in terms of evolutionary theory. I'm not saying he was right. I'm saying he understood evolutionary theory and he could explain what it was supposed to do very, very well. And so the title of his article is Darwin's Greatest Discovery. I would disagree with him. It wasn't a discovery, it was an invention. I would say it's Darwin's greatest invention is this idea that there is design without a designer. So as we turn to the abstract of the paper, I want to highlight a few things that he's saying. He says, with Darwin's discovery of natural selection. Now, he never really did discover it. He completely invented the concept. He even invented the term. Nobody was using the term before Darwin. So to Darwin's credit, he invented the term, he invented the concept. The origin of adaptations of organisms were brought into the realm of science. The adaptive features of organisms could now be explained like the phenomena of the inanimate world as a result of natural processes without recourse to an intelligent designer. That is what Darwin's purpose was. And so this is a big star. From this time going forward, when someone asks you what was Darwin intending to do with his theory, he was intending to explain why creatures look designed without recourse to an intelligent designer. That is what he was after all along. He goes on to say, Darwin's theory of natural selection, and he's going to explain it here, accounts for, quote, the design of organisms. That's what a selection is here to do, is to tell you why they look designed as a result of natural processes, and for their wondrous diversity as a result of natural processes. And this is what he says: the gradual accumulation of spontaneously arisen variations. And he says they're mutations. These are copying errors. These are mistakes that happen over time. These are not, in terms of the theory, purposeful genetic changes. These are mistakes. And they gradually arise and they gradually accumulate. And then he's going to indicate the next important part, which are sorted out by natural selection. And that is the key, and this is what Darwin introduced. When he projected onto nature the ability to select, which was based on his analogy by comparing nature to a human breeder. As human breeders select for traits, they can get varieties of animals. He said, well, maybe nature acts like that breeder, and maybe nature can select for these traits and get bigger varieties of animals if it operates over much, much longer periods of time. But what he did in that is he was able to get God's agency out, and he was able to smuggle in another type of agent. He was able to smuggle in an agency that he could project onto nature by projecting onto nature the ability to select. And in doing so, he projects intelligence and volition, and in doing so, he projects the ability to act. And it is a major personification of nature to act in certain ways. And so here's the quiz. In what you see on the screen right there, where do you see the ability of nature to act? It's right there on the screen. This is a test. This is a challenge. From this point forward, find these action words. Doon, 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 doon. Doon, 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 doo, doo, doo. What are you going to write on your little card there? Nature has the ability to sort out. Sort out. There it is. It's right there. That shows how creationists have been duped and taken in. Can nature really sort out? You can sort. I can sort. God can sort. Even my dog could sort. When I would hide her little medicine pill in her food bowl, after she would eat her entire food bowl, guess what I would find in the bottom of the bowl? Her little medicine pill. Somehow, with her little brain, she could sort it out. She can sort it out. There it is. And you will see this in literature over and over. This will change your life. If you attune yourself to see the verbs over and over and over again that are attributed to nature and natural selection, you will see the personifications. You will see that it acts like an engineer. You will see that it acts like a designer. You will see that it acts like a god. There it is. It sorts out. It sorts out. Or it could have said weeded out, or it could have said called, or it could have said acted on, or it could have said favored, or any number of these things. This is the trick. And an intelligent design advocate just up the road here in Seattle, William Dembski, said, by attributing the ability to select to nature, which it never had and nobody before Darwin was doing, Darwin perpetrated, quote, the greatest intellectual swindle in the history of ideas. Nature has no power to select. And I'm saying you could take the word select, but you can put the word sorted out. Is sorting out a type of selection? Of course it is. There it is. It's there. So from now on, this is my challenge to you. Within 2 to 3 words of the use of natural selection, you will always see a verb. Always see a verb. There will be a verb. And that verb will be the action, and in these scientific papers, that verb will be the cause. I know some of you have never considered this, even though you've been following creation for decades. You will always see the verb. So I'm challenging you. All you got to do is prove me wrong. Say, here's a use of natural selection where they didn't have a verb. But it will be there. This is life-changing. You will from now on see that nature acts as if it's an intelligent agent. And then with this ability to sort out, work on, favor things, he ends by saying this was Darwin's fundamental discovery. It's not a discovery, it's an invention. It's an invention of a way of thinking. That there was a process that is creative, although not conscious. Now stop there. We're not even going to get to past our first slides before we get to our break. But I told you I've been waiting for this talk for such a long time. Does that even make sense? Have you ever seen a process that is creative but not conscious? Never. Never. It doesn't happen. This is the swindle. He supposedly came up with a process that is creative but not conscious. And the only way he gets by with it is because all of us have been missing the smuggled in creativity through all of these verbs attributed to selection when we say it's an unconscious thing. But it's not. It's a trick. It's a trick of the theory. It's a big trick of the theory. And you know who recognizes it? I'll show you. Atheists, later on in my talk. So Charles and Darwin changed the way people understand God by perceiving the way they understand creatures. And we'll dig into this really importantly. And words are really important. The words that you use to characterize objects are indicators of their origins. And so if Darwin is telling you that the origin of the genetic changes is due to random, broken, accumulated junk, you will think differently about that organism than if I tell you that DNA was highly organized, very precise, incredibly intelligent. Junk versus intelligent. And he changes the way you think about creatures. Well, how does that happen? Well, let's play this game. If we or to come up with the top characteristics that I find in scientific papers that are indicative of design. So I turn to engineering papers, and I start writing down the words that are characterizing something that has been engineered. Bing, at the top of the list, purposeful. Survey says, purposeful. And I suspect if we would have had a team here, this side versus that side, we would have said, what do you think is the top word for design? Purposeful. Next, regulated. Next, complex, targeted, orderly, specified, fitting or suitable, and precise. So when I use these words to describe something, I am conveying to your thinking something about what I'm talking about, and it's shaping your thinking. You basically have a high view of what I was describing on that. And now if you turn to evolutionary papers, and we play the same game again, and I've done this because I've gone through many papers, and every word up here is taken from evolutionary papers. What do you think the top anti-design word is that you find in evolutionary papers? Purposeless. Purposeless. That is conveying something to you about its origin when they say this is purposeless. And they argue purposeless on that. Next is random, accidental, trial and error, broken, unplanned, cobbled together. How many of you have read that in papers? The organisms were what? Cobbled together over a period of time. And then biology is just plain messy. Now, when you read these words, it's conveying something to you as well. It's telling you something about what you just saw. And I guarantee you it is not a high view at all that you would think is indicative of an incredibly intelligent, wise engineer. So just by using these words and weaving them into the theory, he never has to say no engineer, no God. Just by getting people to think that this is how it is happening, they conclude no engineer, no God. Does that make sense? Yes. That's how he's doing it. It is woven into the narrative. It's built right into the narrative. And you don't even have to come out and directly attack God, because everybody out there, all of the people outside of this church, everybody in the colleges and universities, when they read these words, they're never going to conclude that a smart thinking designer did it if these are the words to describe it. So what I'm saying is evolutionary theory was built very purposefully to be anti-design. And it was built very purposefully to convey the idea to people, no purpose. No purpose. Does that make sense? Boom. Now you understand evolutionary theory, I guarantee you, better than most evolutionists. Most evolutionists don't even know why their theory was put together. They don't even know why they're using these words. They just hear them. This is what it's supposed to be, so they just roll them into their papers. They're not even thinking there. So control of this whole discussion of how organisms adapt is vital. If organisms could never adapt, if you couldn't change, you couldn't get a theory of evolution going. So how in the world does Darwin do it? He's going to do it in 3 big steps. And I guarantee you have never covered these before. But when you see them, it'll really make sense of what they did. First, Darwin's anti-designer approach to interpreting how organisms adapt is to replace purpose-driven, targeted solutions, which is what an engineer would do, with random, hit-and-miss, trial-and-error process. Get that out. And here's a quote. I actually had 4 of them, but I blanked 3 for the sake of time. On the core tenets of evolutionary theory, M. Graves, and he's even talking about cancer research, summarizes what evolutionary theory is. A classical or Darwinian evolutionary system embodies a basic principle. Purposeless, there it is, genetic variation of reproductive individuals united by common descent, coupled with natural selection of, there it is, of those rare individuals that fortuitously express the traits. It is a process replete with chance. So they bake it right in. The genetic mutations are mistakes. They happen purposelessly, they happen randomly, and they even get sorted out in a random trial and error, hit and miss process. What do they mean by that is, it's survival of the fittest. Most of you won't make it, but occasionally a few lucky ones of you will. It's a process replete with chance. Purpose is out, chance is in. Making sense? That's what they're doing. Next, invert the cause of the organism's change from internal to external. And if you're taking notes, put a big, big star by this. This is a fundamental shift in thinking. Fundamental shift in thinking. Before Darwin, people were focusing on organisms and how they could change themselves. So Darwin built an externalistic framework to interpret the cause of adaptations. In the book, Structure of Evolutionary Theory by Stephen Gould, this is an older picture of Gould there, he points this out. He says that Darwin's theory in strong and revolutionary contrast. And he points out before this that there were other evolutionary theories before Darwin, but the evolutionary theories before Darwin looked at the internal capability of organisms. They were internalistic. And he says here, stomping his foot, Darwin had a revolutionary change in this thinking. Darwin's theory in revolutionary contrast presents the first externalist account of evolution. Darwin overturned all previous traditions by thus granting the external environment a causal and controlling role in the direction of evolutionary change. In other words, before Darwin, people saw creatures as basically changing themselves to adapt to different environments. Darwin said, wrong-o. The environment, through selective pressures, is pushing these passive organisms through space and time, molding and shaping them. He takes and he inverts the causality. You're not shaping yourself, you are being shaped by. Can everybody see that? A big change. One of Stephen Jay Gould's colleagues, Richard Lewontin, who's also dead, he was a famous geneticist at Harvard, he explains it even more clearly. He says, for Darwin, the external world, the environment acting on organisms, was the cause of the form of organisms. The environment, the external world with its autonomous properties, was the subject, and the organism was again the object acted on. And then he explains that this was the cause of all of biology. And then these two researchers, one at UC Berkeley and one at Harvard, he explains what Darwin saw. He, that is Darwin, accepted the view that the environment directly instructs the organism how to vary. The organism was like modeling clay. And this is how you were taught. This is how I was taught. This is how we as creationists have been teaching it. And this is how evolutionists have been teaching it. That selective pressures are molding and shaping organisms. The environment, as it says there, directly instructs organisms how to vary. Now stop right there. Does that make sense? No. I mean, this is what creationists we need to start doing. Read through their stuff carefully and ask, does that make sense? How in the world does the environment send me instructions? Where are the instructions coming from? Who's sending them? How are they being sent? How do I receive those instructions? You know how they do this? They invert everything. What they see is this. I'm an organism, I have a sensor, and I detect something in the environment and I respond to it. They say, when I detect something in the environment, it sent me an instruction. That's how they see it. They see that it sent me the instruction. They don't see the environment as just there and I detect what it is. They see it as sending me an instruction. They see it as changing me. They don't see me as changing myself. Big change in causality. A big change in causality. And Gould said this: variability, according to Darwin's theory, must be, in short, copious, small in extent, and undirected. He adds that, in a sense, the specter of directed variability threatens Darwinism, that is, directed at change, adaptive pressures that automatically trigger heritable variation in favored directions. That's what he means by directed change. Darwin clearly understood the threat of directed variability to his cardinal postulate of the creativity for natural selection. So in other words, it has to send me instructions, and I cannot, according to the theory, detect something and automatically and purposely change for one goal or towards one purpose. That is out. That whole idea of purposely changing for a particular end is completely out of evolutionary theory. As he says here, he uses the word specter. It's a specter. It's a major threat. Purposeful change. These things have to be unpurposeful. So, the big question is, how in the world, though, does Darwin handle agency? Why is it, and this is a big question, why is it that creatures seem to do things on purpose? They seem to do things on purpose. They seem to want to do something. They seem to have goals. How do you handle purpose? How do you get rid of purpose here? Well, Darwin's third point, and this is important, not only does he replace purpose-driven with random, not only does he invert the cause from in the organism to outside the organism, he ends up personifying nature as exercising pervasive agency to work on organisms as a substitute designing agent. Darwin added the vital element of agency to his framework by projecting onto nature intelligence and volition through selection. And here's the man who I quoted to you earlier, and this is the book that I was quoting from, The Design Revolution, William Dembski. That's a younger picture of him. He's got all gray hair now. But he ends up pointing out, before Darwin, the ability to choose was largely confined to designing intelligences, that is, to conscious agents that could reflect deliberatively on the possible consequences of their choices. So stop right here. The next time someone tells you that there were other people who were thinking of selection before Darwin, they're totally wrong. They are ignorant of the history. Before Darwin, nobody was applying selective abilities to nature. Darwin was the first one that did this, and Darwin was ridiculed for it. He goes on to say, Darwin's claim to fame was to argue that natural forces lacking any purposiveness or provision of future possibilities likewise have the power to choose via natural selection. In ascribing the power to choose to unintelligent natural forces, Darwin perpetrated the greatest intellectual swindle in the history of ideas. Nature has no power to choose. Now, do you know who was swindled by this concept? Me. I was swindled by it. And you know who else was swindled? You. You were swindled. We've all been swindled. You know how I used to say it in the days gone by? I would say, well, all natural selection can do is choose from the available things. Can everybody see how I was swindled even by talking like that? Am I personifying it? All natural selection what? can do is, am I talking about it like it's an active agent? Of course I am. All natural selection can do is choose from the available things. Natural selection can't ever make anything from new. How many of you have said that? Come on. You've all said that. You've all said that. And even trying to rebuff it, we reinforce it. Because we treat it like it's this natural agent. And you know who doesn't like it? Pure atheists. Pure atheists like to take their atheism straight. And they don't like to mix in this magical type of agency. All natural selection can do is, that's like an agent. You know, that's not scientific. And they've been criticizing him for that. This man, Stephen Talbot, he caught it really good. He said, evolutionary biologists routinely speak of natural selection as if it were an agent. And therefore, natural selection becomes rather like an occult power of the pre-scientific age. Get it out, he says. This biologist, Michael Hodge, a famous historian of science in Great Britain, in his book, Keywords in Evolutionary Biology, it's a great article. One source of the trouble is that Darwin liked the term natural selection because it could be used as a substantive governing a verb. He could use it like it was a real thing, like it was you. And you can govern verbs. You can act. You can sort out. You can work on. But now he takes a concept, he takes an idea, and he treats it like it could act. It could sort out. It could work on. And way back in the early days of Darwin, as he says in the rest of the quote, but such uses appeared to reify, even to deify, natural selection as an agent. How can these guys catch it, but creationists are missing it? They're not more perceptive than us. He says it deifies it as an agent. As an agent. And so people way back, early on, were criticizing this use of agency of Darwin, so that by 1868, remember, his book was published in 1859. So 9 years after the publication, Darwin was under major attack for this deification of nature. He was already defending himself. He said, quote, the term natural selection is in some respects a bad one, as it seems to imply conscious choice. No duh. I mean, you've applied selective ability to nature. Of course it implies conscious choice. And he really wants it to do that. But this will be disregarded after a little familiarity. Is that what happened? It did. And we were all swindled by that familiarity, by that trite just going over it. All natural selection can do. Boom, I didn't even realize what I was saying. I have also often, personified the word nature. You know why he personifies the word nature? I'll tell you why. Because when you look at creatures, we look like we're the product of a smart agent. And it's really tough to get the work of an agent out. And so he doesn't get the work of an agent out. He just personifies different things. And in this case, nature itself, he personifies nature as if nature could do the work of God. I have personified the word nature, for I have found it difficult to avoid this ambiguity. Of course it's hard to avoid the ambiguity. Try to explain this computer without a computer maker. That's hard to avoid the ambiguity on there. Now, brothers and sisters, let me tie it together and tell you exactly where it is. In Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 25, the Lord is speaking through Paul, and he's expressing these things. And after he says that they reject the invisible things of him which are clearly seen from the creation, they invent all different kinds of excuses to get around it. Eventually, professing themselves to be wise, they become fools. And then in verse 25, he nails exactly what Paul nails exactly what Darwin did. He says, and they exchanged One thing for another. And the King James, it says, and they changed the truth of God for a lie. Literally in the Greek is, they exchanged the true for the false. They exchanged the true for the false. The true what? The true, in context, the true Creator God, because that's what he's talking about. The true Creator God for the false God. How do we know he's talking about that as a false God? Because the very next words indicate it. They changed the true God for the false God and worshiped and served. Worshipped and served. So he's talking about a substitute deity. And he's going to tell us what the substitute deity is in the next phrase. They exchanged the true God for the false God and worshipped and served the creation more than the Creator. This is how Darwin brings it in. He personifies nature to act, work on, favor, shape, mold, design creatures. And now you know what evolutionary theory was about to do, what it was always meant to do. You know. And so we put together a series of three podcasts where we detailed, just in the language of evolutionists, quote after quote after quote after quote with minimal comment. The evolutionists speak for themselves, and I would encourage you to turn to these podcasts. They're very, very good, and they will educate you to this. So this is where Darwin was going. He has a purpose. He has a worldview in mind. It's anti-design. He doesn't want people to think anti-design. He needs to get purpose out, and he needs to get a substitute agent in. Purpose out, substitute agent in. He attacks purpose, going from his materialistic worldview, with his anti-design assumptions there. And as you read scientific literature, you will see a relentless use in the literature of every one of these terms in which evolutionists are indicating no purpose, no goal, no direction, random, hit and miss. And they sum all of this up in this repeated use of the term mutation, which indicates broken, purposeless, definitely not something that's directed. This gives you the anti-design or anti-teleological view. All of this gets summed up in here because mutation are these things. Well, how does he get by with the other agency? They still begin with the same materialistic worldview that nature is all there is, matter is all there is. They have the anti-designer assumption that nature can act like a human breeder. That was Darwin's initial thing. He compares it to a pigeon breeder. This is wrong. This is a fundamentally flawed analogy. Pigeon breeders have brains, nature doesn't. Pigeon breeders can make selections, nature can't. This is their assumption, but it is fundamentally flawed, but absolutely essential to their relentless use in all of their scientific literature, that natural selection or nature can favor, work on, act on, or as even Jerry Coyne said from the University of Chicago, natural selection can see, select, save, and build. And that's how selection becomes the mystical substitute agent. Was this worth the price of admission? Today, you now see it. This is how the theory is built. This is the major drawback in their theory. And if we were to summarize it in a little table right here, and these tables are in some articles that I published in Acts and Facts. And I know you can't read everything in the table, but they come with their externalistic worldview, and they come with some basic assumptions that nature can act like a breeder. Nature can select. Nature's going to cobble together creatures by cobbling and tinkering with them. Many of you have heard the words tinkerer. Nature's a tinkerer. And therefore, nature can direct. And they have some major assumptions. Genetic changes are undirected. And therefore, when they see a genetic change, they will interpret it as a mistake. They will interpret it as random. They will interpret it as breaking things, loss of information, and non-Lamarckian. You know, they don't have tests for those, but this is how their theory guides how they interpret what they see. They believe that adaptation must be gradual. Therefore, they will interpret things as slow, linear, and continuous. They believe that there has to be a huge variety of genetic change within a population so that a trial and error process can sort through it. That's how that works. And so this is how theory guides how you interpret what you see in biology. That's how it is. Now, let's get rid of it. Let's get rid of it. Now that you understand it, let's push back on all of these things and let's build another theory. How does that sound after we take a break? All right? So I turn it over to Mark and we'll take a break and we'll build the next theory.
So, worshiping and serving the creature.
All right. Well, we're going to get rid of that baby on these things. How many of you saw that there's a conference that is going to be at Southwest Bible Church in less than a year? Southwest what? Did I get it right? Southwest Bible Church. In October 2025, please plan on being there. It'll be not just myself, but several ICR speakers. And I hope, and I suspect most all of you are already subscribers to Acts and Facts. Many of you tell me you've been getting it for a long, long time. Please continue to pick this up. And if you haven't got it, it's free. It's always been free. It'll keep you current, and it'll keep you educated as to the latest things that are happening, including our theory of biological design. Okay, we need to get rid of this whole evolutionary explanation. How many of you, as I was going through it, were getting the feeling that this theory that Darwin put together is very subtle? It's very clever. It's very, very misleading on all of these things. It has all of those earmarks of those ways of being major deceptive and things. So, where is this? I don't see I see the bottom of my screen there, but I don't see something must have. Yeah, we'll do this. Let's try that. Better? Does that help you? There you go. For some reason, sometimes when they switch between things, it doesn't call up the right thing on that. All right, number 2. We already are at the stage of abandoning. Now we want to embrace. We want to embrace a new approach to biological adaptation and biology in general. And so we need to move, as it says, back from Darwinism, Darwinian thinking. Remember, I mentioned prior to Darwin, people looked at creatures internalistically. They looked at their capabilities. The reason why Darwin dumped that is because that sounded way, way, way too designed. If organisms changed purposefully, that sounded way too designed. Therefore, he came with his externalistic, the environment shapes and molds. Now we need to go back. You can see we had to lay the foundation of Darwinian thinking because he introduced externalism. And he did that because he wanted to push back against internalism. Therefore, we need to go back to an internalistic view of these organisms. And so remember, I said we had a case study. It was the blind cavefish. Blind cavefish all along. And for decades, the response to the blind cavefish was to say something like this. In fact, I would have said it myself. Darwin's mechanism is true. Selection, mutation is true, but it just can't do everything that Darwin claimed. Not only did I say that, but most of you have said it. I know you have. It's true, but it can't do everything. It's true, but it's limited on those areas. In fact, if you were to have gone to a museum at one time and read the explanation about these blind cave fish, this is what you would have seen if you would have gone and looked at the placard. They would have explained them to you by saying as genetic information is copied and passed on generation after generation, occasionally there are copying mistakes known as mutations. Mutations have been observed to destroy, damage, or corrupt genetic information or to be neutral, but have never been observed to add new information. Sound familiar? This is true even of so-called beneficial mutations that may be advantageous to the surviving organisms in some circumstances. When a mutation occurs in the light environment that causes animals' offspring not to have eyes, it is an enormous disadvantage. So natural selection, remember I said within 2 to 3 words, you will always find a what? A verb. Natural selection what? Eliminates this flaw. When the eyeless defect occurs here, that is in a cave, it does not give any disadvantage, so it is not eliminated. In fact, it gives advantages. Those with eyes can crash into things, injuring their eyes, and can get diseases of the eyes, possibly leading to death. Eventually, selective pressures ensure that all are eyeless. These ghostly fish are prime examples of how mutation and natural selection lead to the reduction of functioning systems. These adaptations are no evidence at all for the belief that complexity has arisen by such processes. They only show how information can be lost in a fallen world. Now, all of this should sound really familiar to you because you've been saying it. You've been saying it, and we taught it to you. This was ICR's original explanation for cave fish in our museum. Needless to say, it is not in our current museum on that. You know what? And by the way, parenthetically, I take that as a warning to me to be extremely careful in what I teach, because people are going to hang on it. And they're going to repeat it. And so I try to assure you, I am trying to be extremely careful before I teach you some things. But I can say this, summing up, theistic selectionism is what I would have been. Creationists also claim that the surface-dwelling ancestors gradually morphed into the cave, that it was due to random genetic mutation which led to broken systems, through a purposeless trial and error process of death and survival called natural selection, which resulted in a loss of information, produced depigmentation and blindness, and selection pressures ensured all are blindless, all are eyeless. You know what? If I were to ask you, how in the world does that differ from how an evolutionist would explain it, you would have to say, no difference. There's not a dime's worth of difference. And we can do better than that. Of course, we might have put this at the end of it, but all that shows us how to break something and not to make something. We can do much, much better than that. And not only that, there's some major problems with this. It derailed scientific information because nobody was looking for the non-random. In fact, nobody, creationists or evolutionists, were even asking questions. Well, could these fish have gone blind on purpose? That wasn't even on the table. Nobody was asking for it. Could they have happened through some non-random process? Nobody was looking for the non-broken. They're blind due to broken genes. And the mutation selection is a process that no rational engineer would use. It was just a creationist light version of real evolution. We can do better than just simply saying that Darwin's mechanism is true, but it's inconsistent or insufficient or incomplete or inaccurate. And these are the headlines that we normally put. It's inconsistent. Well, it's irreducibly complex. Ant eyes defy evolution. All of these things were really wrong. But more importantly, none of them were really actually lifting high the name of Jesus. None of them were really pointing to a design mechanism. So this man, Paul Nelson, he came up with a quote that I wish I would have said. We need to do biology as if Darwin had not been born. What would things be like if that had happened? Well, let's develop a theory of biological design, including some major assumptions. All theories have some assumptions. So let's go to the current state of things. And you have the realm of engineering. And engineering principles explain how man-made things work. All man-made things can be explained by these engineering principles. And then we have the realm of biology, of which we recognize life and consciousness and agency. And there are 4 biological functions which all living creatures do. All of them reproduce and grow, and all of them adapt and metabolize. They take things from their environment and they turn it into energy, or they build their bodies. And sometimes we say, well, maybe adaptation has some engineering elements and metabolism does, but surely reproduction and growth don't, because engineers have never made a reproducing thing, or they never made anything that's grown. That is incorrect. Engineers have made reproducing things. And engineers could engineer something that could reproduce itself. Engineers could find something that could take in resources, manufacture those resources, build a copy of itself. Why is that inconceivable from an engineering standpoint? It isn't. We could make something that could reproduce itself. It would be incredibly, incredibly, incredibly complicated. But you could do it. So we're not even looking at this right. Maybe we should develop a working hypothesis that biological functions can be accurately explained by engineering principles. All of them. Adaptation and so on. Not life, not consciousness, not agency, but in terms of their biological functions. So maybe we could develop another working hypothesis that analyzing human engineering practices will inform biological research. It'll help us predict things. It'll help set direction of where we should research. And it could direct researchers towards accurate predictions and research endeavors. In other words, if here's a man-made engineering thing and it's doing function X, and I look at a living creature and it's also doing function X, maybe it's doing it with the same engineering principles that the man-made thing, and maybe I should start researching in that direction. Does that make sense? So it can guide us in research. A theory of biological design, that's how I abbreviate it, theory of biological design, expects corresponding system elements and corresponding systems between human engineered things and God-made things, which I will call biological mechanisms performing similar functions. A theory of biological design assumes and expects purposeful systems within all areas of biology. What do I mean by that? At the molecular level, the molecules, I'm expecting to find purposeful design and purposeful relationships. At the system level, purposeful. Organ level, organ system level, organism level, across the thing, and even in the ecosystem level, I'm expecting to find that purpose. Next hypothesis is that basic research of biological functions and the technical applications of those are both within the realm of engineering. Both of these are within the realm of engineering because, as far as I know, no biological function yet has eluded an explanation by an engineering principle. And not only that, biology from the very beginning has always been a type of engineering, even though biologists didn't know it. When biologists take a living system and they take it apart piece by piece, and they study and analyze those elements, and they study how they might all fit together into a system. That is called reverse engineering. So it's always been reverse engineering. It's always been reverse engineering. They may not have known it. And there's this known consistency. As I said, it's always been there between human engineered systems and biological systems. So I will be waiting, and I think I'm going to be waiting for a long time, when someone finds something in biology that just can't be explained by engineering, that operates in ways that we just can't figure it out. So engineering principles are currently applied to biology. How do I know this? Well, two distinct biological categories are recognized. These researchers state it pretty clearly. They say, however, in order to complete the revolution, that is starting with DNA and its biological functions, something fundamental is still missing from modern biology, as evidenced by difficulties in tackling, quote, the hard questions, such as biological nature of feelings, emotions, qualia, that's your subjective experiences, and consciousness. These are not trivial problems. However, the true nature of these inherent phenomena is still elusive and highly controversial. In other words, when you're looking for biology, where do I find the root of these emotions? Where am I finding the root of agency? In fact, even more fundamentally, where am I finding life? As far as I know, no biologist has ever held a beaker of life. Here's a beaker of life. Study it. Here's a handful of agency. Give me a pound of your consciousness. So, let's think about it different. Let's pull these babies out, life, consciousness, and agency, and let's admit what evolutionists are unwilling to admit is these do not come from your biological functions. These are probably immaterial, totally immaterial. These are the real you. And this stuff is just keeping the link between the real you through your biological body to connect to this world. But when this biological body is dead, the real Randy goes on. Because that is not coming about due to engineering or biology. It's immaterial. And my immaterial thoughts, which start in my mind, and I execute through my voice, which compresses air and goes across the room to you, which your tympanic membranes pick up, send signals to your brain decodes those, and bang, they pop in thoughts into your brain. I have just taken thoughts of my mind, put them over to your mind, but your brain did not get 1 gram heavier. It didn't change at all, the mass. And let's start explaining these things in terms of biological functions. Let's believe the reason why these things look like they were engineered is because they were engineered. So let's start looking at it that way. And then let's move back to an inherently internalistic approach. And in some, it says this. This goes way back to the 1950s when they're making these little satellites. If you want to know what this satellite is going to be able to do, you better study the satellite. And if you want to know what an organism is going to do, you have to study the organism. So I put this in Acts and Facts. It's an outline for a theory of biological design, where I came up with basic assumptions that biology within an engineering-based framework is integrated. Both technical applications and basic research are within the range of engineering. It's comprehensive. It relates to all of the biological functions. Looking at engineering systems are instructive for doing biology, and it's directive. I expect to find corresponding principles. I have basic assumptions as well. First, it's intentionalistic. I'm expecting to find goal-directed activity at every level of research, as I already mentioned. It's internalistic. In other words, identifiable control systems within an organism are the true cause of their functions, including their adaptations. This is testable. I'm saying if something is happening in you right now, and there's literally thousands of things happening in you, how that is being executed, I will be able to find the control system within you that's regulating it. Now I can start to look for them. I can start to test that. I can start to look for these things. And then agency, that you are an autonomous entity. There is a real boundary where you begin and you end. There's a real boundary for you. Evolutionists tend to blur these boundaries, that everything is individualistic. And therefore, I am going to interpret what I see differently. Since it's intentionalistic or it's purpose-driven, when I see a genetic change that is adaptive, my default interpretation is that it was directed. When I look at biological functions, I am expecting coherence of those systems. I'm expecting to find what is now called irreducibly complex systems. I'm expecting to find a system where A is necessary to make B, but B is necessary to make A, because engineers can put A and B in place at the same time, but from an iterative standpoint, you can't get there. Does that make sense? Engineers can do that. I'm expecting to find evidence of foresight. I'm expecting to find proactive things, where organisms, and I have a whole lecture on this, can detect environmental changes now, and it sets into motion a whole series of changes where they are going to react proactively in anticipation of those changes coming. That is really cool. That's really cool. Second, I'm going to see it as internalistic. I'm going to be focusing. If I want to study a space shuttle, I focus on the space shuttle. If I want to study you, I focus on you. Internalistic, that there's unity, that the organism is the directing program. That means just looking at the genes alone is out. The genes are a subsystem of the creature. They serve to meet the needs of the creature. They're not running the show. It's the creature as a whole. It's the creature as a whole which is the functioning system. I give precedence that when something happens in an organism's response, the external thing did not cause it. It's my traits which caused me to change purposefully in response to that thing. That's what precedence is. Triggers. I anticipate, just like any engineered thing, that if something out there is called a trigger or a stimuli, it's because an engineer built something in me specifying that condition will be a stimuli. I will have a sensor. I will have a way to respond to it, and I will have a purposeful response. Nothing in and of itself is a stimuli until I, my engineer, specify that to be a stimuli. Does that make sense? That's a radical change. It says I specify things to be stimuli, and so on and so forth. Information and adaptation, and then in terms of agency, we could talk a long time on these. But the big one is this. From an engineering standpoint, in order for an entity, one, to work with entity two, it doesn't just happen by magic. If I want two things to work together, I will build an interface that enables them to work together, a way to identify self from non-self, protocols enabling to communicate or exchange information or maybe exchange materials with each other and a common medium that both of them can get a hold of. And when I build that interface, organism A can now work with organism B. So I am now looking for interfaces, designed interfaces, enabling all these organisms to work together. Wow. You know what? They're there. And you know how this glorifies the Lord Jesus Christ? Because in order to build an interface between organism A, you have to know a lot about organism A. And in order to build it with B, you have to know a lot about organism B. And when I know those things, I can build an interface which connects them. But it looks like in nature, almost everything is connected with something else in some way. That means whoever built all of these interfaces knows everything about everything. Now that glorifies the Lord. That's how it glorifies the Lord. Amen. I mean, praise Him. It is so good. And you can test it. You can look for the interfaces. You can find these things. Wow. We need to do new models of everything. Build engineering-based models. Now you notice, I don't use the word design a lot. I use engineering. And that's because there's a difference between design and engineering. You and I can design something, but it may not be engineered. Engineering puts tests to things. Tests that make sure it works right. I'll give you an example. When I was a kiddo, I found an old motorcycle frame, but it didn't have an engine on it. But I found an engine that I wanted to mount to this motorcycle, and I was in maybe 5th grade. And so I came up with a wooden block that connected the exhaust port on the engine to the tailpipe on this motorcycle. And it was able to hold the engine in place right to the tailpipe of that. And I made it out of wood because I'm 5th grade. That's all I've got. And so I drilled a hole in it to let the exhaust gases out of the engine, and I drilled some holes so I could put a bolt in it, and I bolted this engine to the motorcycle, and now I had an engine mounted to the motorcycle frame. And I started the engine. And soon, my connector was on fire. It's because, wow, I was not an engineer. I had no idea how hot the gases were coming out of the engine, and it would ignite my mount. Now, was my mount designed? Was my mount engineered? No. That's the difference. Creatures are not just designed, we're engineered to work. So engineering says it deals with the work factor. So, I never told that story in public before. This is the first time that I've told that. That's because you give us enough time to talk. When I look at scientific papers, these are the words that are governing organisms, not random, regulated, rapid, repeatable, sometimes reversible, and targeted responses. And so in terms of how organisms adapt, we have a model called continuous environmental tracking that says what organisms seem to be able to do is track environmental changes, everything from rapid physiological changes to acclimation and habituation and eventually multi-generational changes. And how they do it is through many innate systems. There is not a system for adaptation. There are many mechanisms that enable organisms to track the changes around them, around things. I've put this together, taken it to many scientific meetings in a poster, just like everybody does. These were all my evidences, all my examples of how organisms do this. These are my questions I needed to ask, and I let people criticize what I'm talking about in these areas. And so CET is fundamentally internalistic, which means it focuses on the organism. Anything that these fish, these birds, moths are going to be able to do is built inside of them. And if you want to discover the secrets, you look here. It's organism focused, not the environment focused. Second, CET is engineering based. As I already went through the assumptions, we have assumptions that are engineering based. We have assumptions that engineering principles are going to explain biological functions. These are going to direct our research by forming our questions. But here's a major difference. Engineering always puts the solutions up front. So you see a space shuttle here that's going through all of these different environments. I guarantee you that engineers studied the environments to figure out the challenges of these environments, and then, like smart engineers, they built into the space shuttle the solutions to those challenges before the space shuttle met the challenges. Evolutionists say the solutions are due to the challenges. I'm saying wrong. The solutions are there prior to meeting to the challenges. Here's an example. This is one of my favorites because it's so easy to understand. This is an autonomous car. It's an early version. You can see it has sensors all over it, and it's packed with computers. This car, if you put enough fuel in it, could drive from Portland to Miami, and it could drive around bad weather and traffic jams. That's because it can detect and sense things in the environment. It can download information, and it has logic that says, if there's this traffic jam, then take this other route. And it can do those kinds of things. Sensors, logic, and a way to respond. You need those things in order to adapt. Can that explain this headline? Guinea pigs beat climate change by tweaking their own DNA. Tweaking your own DNA. So in this experiment, they took 5 male guinea pigs. They wanted to know how they respond to climate change. So they put a heating pad in the bottom of their cage, and they cranked up the heat. And if you know anything about male guinea pig anatomy, you know what's down there on the heating pad on that. And they left them at that high temperature for 70 days. Why? Because it takes 70 days to go from a stem cell to a mature sperm cell. 70 days to do that. Then they took these male guinea pigs and they mated them with females that were not in hot cages. She had pups. They can sequence DNA. They can identify at least 18 genes that are changed that all relate to thermoregulation in one generation. Not only are the pups' DNA changed, but even dad's DNA is changed. That's why they say it's tweaking their own DNA. Now I, as an engineer, and through this theory, now I'm looking for a temperature sensor on those male guinea pigs. You know why? It's going to be there. It's not magic how they detect that temperature change. They will have a sensor. And they will have something that regulates their DNA, and they will have a control system which tweaks it. Do you see how engineering tells you this is going to be there? It's not magic. So go look for those things. Here's another one. Everybody can see the beetle on the left, that brown beetle, and everybody can see the ants on the right. But that is not an ant. That's that beetle. When that beetle detects that it's in the presence of army ants, which would normally eat the beetles, it can morph. It can morph to look like an ant. In fact, here is the ant, and now here's the beetle. It looks like this ant. It smells like the ant. It behaves like the ant. It exudes pheromones like that ant, so much so that the army ants bring that beetle into their nest, and that beetle starts taking care of their larvae. But now the beetle isn't doing it to the benefit. It's like 2 for you, 1 for me. And this beetle has been demonstrated that it can morph into at least 9 different shapes of different army ants. This is quite remarkable. Here's another one. In fact, the researcher says that they thought this thing was poised for myrmecophilia, poised already to look like an ant. Repeated diversification of ecomorphs on Hawaiian stick spiders. Here's a stick spider. It's a gold one. This one lives on leaves, but there's a brown one which lives on tree trunks, and there's a white one which lives on lichen. These researchers found that when a gold one goes to another island in the Hawaiian Islands, it can morph into the brown and white one shapes before the brown and white ones ever get to the island. The gal who was the researcher on this, she wrote that the Aramnus spiders have some sort of pre-programmed switch in their DNA that can be quickly turned on to allow them to evolve rapidly into those successful forms. But how this process might work is still unclear. Well, I can give you a way to clear it up. Think about them as if they're engineered. Think about them as if they were made to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and go from island to island. Start looking for sensors. Start looking for that innate logic. Start looking for those output responses. That's how they're going to be able to do these things. Here's another research on E. coli bacteria. They took separate populations of E. coli bacteria, exposed these populations to challenging conditions. And they found that predictable evolution trumps randomness of mutations. What did they find? They found these exact same genetic changes in all three independent populations of the E. coli bacteria arising independently and exactly the same. And so this is almost heretical. Predictable? Why do you call it evolution? Why don't you just say predictable adaptations, predictable changes? Trumps randomness of mutation on that. The funny thing is, even though they show it trumps randomness of mutation, they still repeat the religious mantra of evolutionists, and they begin their papers by saying, although mutations occur at random, we now know they don't. But they do in this case. Here is another one, an interesting study. Direct observation of adaptive tracking on ecological timescales of Drosophila. Oh, this was an interesting study because, first of all, because my model is called continuous environmental tracking. And this was a huge study with well over 100,000 fruit flies. And they could sequence them genetically, not all 100,000, samples of 10 different populations. 10 different populations of fruit flies with 10,000 or more of fruit flies in each of these separate populations. And they just tracked them for 4 months over the change of the seasons. And this is what they found genetically, that all of the populations were changing in lockstep. And here is the graph of all of those changes. The press release from Penn State, rapid adaptation in fruit flies. And this is how they characterize that. They said in earlier studies, I'll blow it up for you here real big. In earlier studies at Philadelphia area orchards, Schmidt and colleagues had seen that the fruit flies present at the beginning of the growing season were quite different from those buzzing around in late fall in measures of stress tolerance, reproductive fitness, and even pigmentation. But the research couldn't rule out the possibility that the new flies were entering the population and causing some dramatic shifts. Well, they eliminated that from their study. And they found that over the course of the experiment, which lasted 4 months, the researchers documented changes in what? 60% of the fly's genome. With this direct observation of swift and continuous adaptation in response to the environment, a phenomenon known as adaptive tracking, the biologists have established a new paradigm in how to think about the time scale of evolution. They go on to say this: we see that the populations are able to track differences in the environment, says Schmidt. This was not a response to a single selective event, such as drought. The populations were constantly evolving. Why don't we just say adapting and shifting throughout the entire experiment? I would argue that these processes are taking place in a lot of different organisms, but they're harder to measure over the appropriate time scale. But what made the finding particularly compelling was that the direction of adaptation changed multiple times, swinging like a pendulum as environmental conditions changed. This is why evolutionary theory is in the crossroads. How's evolutionary theory going to deal with findings like this? We can deal with it because my model is even called continuous environmental tracking, which seems like what these organisms are doing. And if we had more and more time, I could go with literally dozens of different examples. I could show you papers that say the whole concept of random mutations is out. It's something that needs to be retired. We now see highly directed mutations. We see things happening very purposefully at specific areas on the genome. So once we come up with a new theory and once we come up with new paradigms, now we need to do some new research, which then takes us back to our case study of these cave fish. How in the world do you go from the surface fish to the blind one? How do you go from being pigmented to non-pigmented? So ICR's cave fish research is not looking just for answers to an evolutionary claim. It's testing their theory against our theory. Theory versus theory. And so that's what it does. It tests the important assumptions of evolutionary theory with the assumptions of CET model. And one of my assumptions is this, that if organisms have sensors and built-in logic giving them suitable responses, if they detect similar conditions and have similar internal programming, I expect similar responses. Therefore, if these creatures can detect a condition like a cave, and if that programming says turn off your eyes, turn off your pigmentations, change your circadian rhythms, augment wakefulness, tail, mechanosensation, and all these other things. And by the way, let me give you just a few more, since you guys are serious researchers. It's not just eyes and pigmentation that change. The way these fish feed changes, therefore their skull changes. The way they sense the world around them without eyes changes. They increase the number of neuromasts on their face. The lateral line, that silver line down the side of the fish, increases the number of receptors there. Their blood cells change because they're living in an environment with low oxygen. Their cardiovascular system changes. Their metabolism changes. When they eat any bit of food that they find, it gets stored as fat. There are many, many changes, not just eyes and pigmentation, that these fish have to have in order to live in an environment. But what's more remarkable, it's not just fish that do it. There are many creatures that live in caves: salamanders, crustaceans, insects, huge centipedes, spiders. All different kinds of creatures seem to be engineered by the Lord to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, including caves. And they're all expressing these similar things. Now, when you see something expressing these similar traits, the whole idea of random mutations and all these creatures, all these happenings, that should get remote. And you should start thinking, maybe they were engineered to do this. Maybe they're engineered to do these kinds of things. So evolutionists, just looking at pigmentation, they think the genes are broken. They call it loss of function mutations in the OCA2 gene, oculocutaneous albinism gene. They think that these genes have been mutated away and broken. And then they say something like this: for reasons currently unknown, OCA2 seems to be evolution's favorite for pigment regression. It happens over and over again. That was your test. What did you just read? It seemed to be evolution's what? Favorite. That was a personification slipping in right before your very eyes. Evolution's favorite. Every population, it seems to be broken. I find it in this population, I find it in that, I find it in this. Therefore, it's evolution's favorite. The agency and the personifications are there. Just find them. They go on to say mutations have occurred in both the Pacan and Molino OCA2 genes. Thus, OCA2 gene is repeatedly targeted for mutation in cavefish. Targeted by what? resulting in independent origins of albinism. Another paper says the melanocortin-1 receptor has been mutated repeatedly to generate the same troglomorphic, those are cave-like phenotypes in different cavefish populations. So according to their theory, evolution predicts genetic changes are random and broken genes, which overwhelmingly results in these broken genetic pathways, which leads to a loss of function. In this case, no pigmentation. They think that mutations over a long time have destroyed these genes, and therefore they've lost their ability to pigment. I would say wrong. These organisms appear to be engineered. Therefore, pigmentation is probably a trait that can be modulated up when necessary and modulated down. Modulated up, modulated down. Broken, modulatable. We can put that to the test. Genetic changes and physiological changes, I would say, are purposeful. They're not necessarily due to broken pathways. As I said, pigmentation can be modulated. So let's test it. Here's a fish. It's a female, obviously, blind cavefish. She's hypopigmented right there. What if we stick her back in the sun? What if we put her in conditions where we mimic the sun's intensity and wavelength and duration and all of those things? What's going to happen to her? If her genes are broken, she's going to stay pink. If they can be modulated, she'll regain her pigmentation. And this is the same fish in 30 days. Broken genes, modulatable. Modulatable. This is her in 30 days. And this is the male, just to show we don't discriminate on that. And they're not dead. We just got them to lay flat for the picture on that. Here we are, the cave fish at the bottom, surface fish on the top, boom, pigmented. And then we're able to quantify the pigmentation in many ways. Looking at the eyes, researchers, we know that the eyes can be turned off at least in one generation, because this paper, which came out in 2013 on that, studied the eyes and the modulation of a protein called heat shock protein 90 as a capacitor for heat loss. And they were able to show with a chemical which modulates this that they can go from sighted and pigmented to blind and hypopigmented in one generation. They found that these fish seem to be detecting water conductivity, so now we're doing experiments to see what is regulating this. What is regulating? I said we're going to look for regulating mechanisms. We do know when these fish mate and they have eggs in the water that initially the eggs all start to develop an eye. So the ability to make an eye is still there. But after about 24 hours, the lens starts to shut down, regress, and the eye regresses. And then it eventually is ejected. That's not happening by magic. That's happening purposefully, and there will be control systems regulating it. We just have to find them. We have to find what's happening. Not only can you regain your pigmentation, but it's modulatable. So here is a fish that was put in simulated cave condition, a river fish, and here is what it looks like after losing its pigmentation. In fact, we can demonstrate that the fish begin to lose their pigmentation within hours. Hours of being put in simulated cave conditions. And then we can do tests on the one generation after another that fish that are born this way. Here's a surface fish, and here's deionized fish already losing its pigmentation, allowing the pinkish cover to come through in just 2 hours. So, the standard CET prediction is that these things would be purposeful and they're not due to broken pathways. And I think we basically have been able to demonstrate that. And so CET, in terms of what it brings to creation science, is the anti-Darwinian explanation of biological adaptation. Remember, Darwinism is the anti-design. We bring an anti-Darwinian. We're not taking mutation selection as true but limited. We're saying, gone, out the door, kick it out, let the dead bury their dead. Let's replace it with something new altogether. A thoroughly engineering-based explanation that's completely organism-focused. It uses purposeful, non-random mechanism and rejects all mystical selectionist thinking. What I mean by mystical, I'm talking about selection events, which nobody can identify, selection pressures, which nobody's been able to quantify, units of selection, which nobody can even identify, those kinds of things. That's the mysticism that we're getting rid of. And so now we can get a head-to-head test between two different theories. Currently, you have the non-designed random adaptive process of Darwinian selectionism. It's externalistic. Quote, passive organisms shaped by the vicissitudes of nature. I took that from an evolutionary paper. Adaptations are characterized as completely undirected through a trial and error process of hit and miss, survival of the fittest. And that they believe that the changes have to be very small, very iterative, nothing tantamount to a miracle, very gradual and very linear, or to use the words of Darwin himself, due to numerous successive slight modifications. That's what Darwin said. Can we come up with something better? Yes. We can come up with a completely different paradigm that instead of being non-designed as design, instead of being random as purposeful adaptive processes. Instead of seeing passive organisms externalistic, we see active organisms shaping themselves to solve problems, not passive modeling clay, active organisms. Instead of adaptations being undirected, highly regulated with identifiable control systems. Targeted solutions, predictable, repeatable, reversible, with targeted solutions right to the problem, and if necessary, variable in extent. Sometimes it can be rapid, sometimes it can be slow, sometimes it has to change to a quick environmental change, sometimes it takes and just refines the trait of the organism better to the environment. It's necessary on these areas. So we have something that can completely replace Darwinian evolution. So if I could just leave you with one thing to summarize everything, the next slide is just this, ICR. From this day forward, you'll change your view of the Lord Jesus and his glory if you stop seeing organisms as passive modeling clay being shaped by the vicissitudes of nature over long periods of time. Dump that. What I want you to stop seeing organisms as passive modeling clay being shaped by nature. That brings no glory to the Lord. Start seeing them as active problem solvers, which can detect their challenges, solve those challenges, and be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Start seeing them as active problem solvers with the innate capacity to detect their challenges, solve their challenges, be fruitful, and multiply, and fill the earth. That system reflects the incredible genius of the Lord Jesus, his power to put it into place, and his wisdom to bring about optimized, efficient, perfect solutions. You're changing your view of these creatures will change your view of their creator. Amen? Amen. So thank you very much.